This next one, and oh gosh, this is a doozy, is going to take a lot longer to kind of uncover and discuss. So this is written by Grace Lin, who I'm sure you've heard of her. She's like the most famous Chinese American children's book author in America. A little background: I listened to her TED Talk right after reading this book, and also worth noting, automatically at the end of her TED Talk video, it centers on a white adoptive parent talking about how hard it is to find books for her child of color. Again, you would ask, why wasn't that TED Talk done by a person of color talking about growing up trying to find themselves reflected, which is something we've been talking about for super long, but apparently it's only news when a nice white lady talks about it. She did a good job, but seriously, everything's always going to center back to whiteness unless you actively push against it. So Grace Lin actively rejected her Chinese culture. She wanted nothing to do with it. She rejected the idea of learning Chinese. She wanted to see herself as white. She was surprised when she saw herself in the reflection and saw herself as Asian. That is actually something that is very common. I've experienced that myself. That kind of self-hate, wishing that you were the beautiful, blonde, blue-eyed ideal of American beauty. Unfortunately, that has really carried through. She's been fighting with it, and she's been uncovering it and trying to fix it, but that still carries through to her books. All of her books, her picture books at least, her chapter books might be different, really focus on the white gaze, and they focus on all of the Asian people exist as a representation of Chinese Americans. These books exist like Yum Yum Dim Sum, I think it's called. Like, it's to teach people who have never been to dim sum what it looks like to eat dim sum. Because if you have eaten dim sum, it's just a boring book about eating lunch, right? You don't really have white people just eating cheeseburgers, and that's the whole book, because that'd be boring. She's lovely, but her books are super boring. And they're sanitized and made easier for white people to feel like they're doing the work of not being racist, because you say, I'm not racist, I have Grace Lin books on my bookshelf. Not realizing that the portrayal of the Grace Lin characters are one-dimensional and flat and serve to destigmatize and serve to teach white people about Asian people, and they don't really give us any complexity, any interesting adventures. Again, chapter books might be different, but her picture books, they suck a little bit. So they're written to educate outsiders. This in particular, the ideal of Grace Lin is to center on whiteness. European fairy tales at the time, and she has apologized for this book, which is a huge credit to her, lacking specificity. It could have been a good learning experience, which she did not take advantage of, but European fairy tales are her ideal, right? Because she's raised in a culture of whiteness. So who is speaking is the question in all of these books. And if it's an adoptee who's speaking, usually they're speaking to the reader and saying, hey, things are okay. It's okay that I'm adopted. I'm kind of proud of it. In this case, the parents are speaking. Like, she just bypasses all of the ideas that the adopted person is the central person, whose story this is really designing. So you start out with these parents, and this child is asking for a book, but they don't actually have any lines. The parents speak for her. This story, again, you've heard it 100 times. Are you sure? Okay, I'll read it. No lines. And then you see this glorious, beautiful European fairy tale environment, and it goes like this. Once a king and a queen ruled over a magnificent kingdom. Their subjects loved them. Their castle shone like the sun, and there was never any famine or drought. They knew they were very lucky. Yet something was missing. Now, if we're following this narrative of America the Beautiful as the pinnacle of civilization, which is the way that we are raised to believe that our country is, versus the places where famines and droughts happen, you're setting that scaffolding for superior, ideal place for children to be raised, and inferior, impoverished land where they should not. Also, the word famine is super, super loaded for Chinese people. Almost all of us have ancestors who have died in famines. My great-grandmother, my great-uncles, they died in famines. My grandmother grew up in a home where they were starving to death. So that has an impact on a lot of Asian Americans, particularly since most of us weren't allowed to come to this country legally until about 1965, 1967, right when my dad came here, because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So most of us have ancestors who permanently or temporarily lived in China and experienced some famine or another. So this is very loaded. They're really pointing that out, and I feel like it's almost unfair because she probably knows that. Her parents are from Taiwan. Now, granted, Lynn Grace admits that she writes what she wants to know, not what she does know. She's not a transracial adoptee, and she has experience living as the Chinese person in white spaces and how uncomfortable that is. But that's something that it's weird that she took on this message that's very much dedicated to the parents. Now, Europe is a magnificent kingdom where there's never any famine or drought. Later in the book, you're going to see that China is full of, strange, friendly people that they don't understand who chatter a language, which is a very English and white-centered thing to say as a Chinese person. And you're going to notice that a lot of Chinese people do this, a lot of Asian people do this, because they're trying to prove, like, hey, we're white, we understand. Chinese sounds ridiculous. Everyone always sounds angry when they're talking, right? And it's a way of keeping ourselves safe and making sure that we're included in white spaces. We're included on white bookshelves. We have to, prove that we understand that Chinese people are a little weird, right? In order to be accepted, which follows into that whole model minority thing. Okay. Still trying to keep it fast. Now, this goes on and on and on. Their pain, poor them. Oh no, their pain, so much, the suffering. Now, I have been infertile. I did infertility treatments. I was infertile for 7 years. I was on bed rest. I almost died with one of my miscarriages. I've lost 2 children. Infertility sucks, but we don't need to go on and on and on about it in a children's book, because why do children need that? Who is this message for? Again, this is to validate the pain of the parents. It's not for the children. We don't need to put that on our kids. They can know about it, but we don't need to harp on it, right? And really center ourselves. And here's infertility treatments. The healers made them drink special teas. They saw doctors and scientists, wise men and women. The king and queen began to lose hope that their suffering would end. And the premise is they were infertile. They really wanted a child. So adoption automatically becomes second option. That child, whoever they adopt, is a door prize. This is what they wanted, and adoption is what they settled for, which is messed up. This is something that people would ask me. They'd say, well, why are you doing all of this? This seems really hard. Why not just adopt? Which erases the pain and anguish and difficulty and rejection that potential adoptive parents face. It erases the stigma and ableism that parents face when they're trying to adopt and they get rejected because of their weight, because of their disabilities, because of their race, because of their career. Erases all of that. And it erases the loss that has to happen with a gestational parent or a first parent in order to bring this child into a different family. So this peddler shows up. I guess, adoption agency or whoever this is supposed to be. It's kind of like a wise, helpful person who shows up and helps them. Seriously, they go on and on with the pain and the suffering and these poor people. And then they go on and they're being pulled by this terrible red thread and their clothes are starting to tatter and they have to spend so much money or something. I don't know. I think it's code for having to deal with adoption agencies. It was a long and difficult journey. Snow fell, and sharp rocks made holes in their shoes. The king and queen shivered in the cold, and their fine clothes ripped from wear. Kind birds flew to help them untangle the thread from tree branches. I don't know what that's code for. That just seems like nonsense. But the king and queen continued. They knew following the red thread was their only cure. As they traveled, the thread grew shorter and shorter. Oh, good. Okay. So, again, we're getting into the wolf in sheep's clothing, where your child is a ticking time bomb. With every stroke of the oars, they wondered what was pulling the thread. They had to cross the ocean to get from Europe to China. I don't really understand this, but okay. Was it a ferocious beast or a cruel magician? What would they do when they met whatever was on the other end? Again, ferocious beast, cruel magician. Who's pulling those strings? Who is harming them? And who has the responsibility to cure them? The child. Passive victims and heroes and martyrs, and this other, right? That's messed up. Okay, so I feel like we just need to, the child is an object of desire. The child is an object. The pain of infertility was not caused by my children taking too long to show up. It wasn't their responsibility. The child is not a cure. Becoming a mother was not a cure for infertility and for my need to be a parent. The same way that having Q and R2, my living children, will never be a cure for losing Rocket and Thisbe, my first children. So this idea of them just like living happily ever after all of this bullshit is very annoying. Okay, so the wolf in sheep's clothing, this monster of unknown danger. They go in and they show up and they go to this, backwards village or whatever, and everyone seems strange. They took little notice of anyone because who cares about the actual community that this child was born into and the people who have been raising and caring for this little girl. And then they follow it, and oh, look at the ferocious beast the monster's been pulling on them. What a heartless monster, right? And look at how, her clothes are shredded, her hair's a mess. That poor woman, right? I mean, the child, it's fine, that hasn't experienced any trauma or loss or... and then the Chinese people this one knows English for some reason. I don't know, she shows up. And despite them chattering, which is, the word she used, they just hand this baby over. They're not like, hey, let's find another family. They're like, this child is yours. It's got red threads tied to its ankle that you guys are attached to. Clearly it's yours and we don't actually care. This is an issue. I mean, we have a history in China of devaluing our women, of killing, including some of my great aunts. We've killed them at birth, right? This is a valid issue. That said, it's a little bit messed up to depict in a children's book how cavalier the Chinese are about giving away their children. I promise you, when my great-great-grandmother told her husband to smother her newborns in the ashes, that wasn't just something she just tossed out. That was a decision that she made because she knew, based on her life and the life of all the women she knew, that their lives would be so fucking miserable that it would be better to kill them. I disagree with this, obviously, but this is not a thing that you don't just take it lightly, right? There have been traumatic effects for generations because of the choices that we make when we're living in a famine and when we're living in poverty and when we're living in a system that abuses and hates women, right? That would be something we could handle, maybe touching on, but this casual, just like, here, take the baby, not okay. And it very much erases, you don't see the gestational parents, you don't see that they have some feelings towards this child. Yeah. And a credit to this book is this is one of the only books that actually even shows the place where she's coming from. Usually it's just like the baby just shows up on a plane, right? And then the only person who really gets credit, they don't care about what happened to the gestational family. Like they just, I think they actually mentioned that, just like it doesn't matter. They want to search for the peddler, this adoption agent or whatever, to give him gold or jewels or something. They want to reward him for his help because he was instrumental in finding their child. And then they go on to say, like, yes, it's our favorite story too. And again, the little girl has no language, no agency. She's not a person. Okay. We'll move on to Orange Peel Pocket in the next one.